Hello, and welcome to an adventure like no other. Far more than what you have known, there is something far more to be known than you can ever know. And it is all about you, the real you, your real awareness with your intuitive senses. You were never taught that the real you, your real awareness, is operating 5 bodies in cause and effect, restricting creation. You have been taught to think that you are only a one-dimensional human person, with a mind and emotions, and with a very short lifespan on this planet Earth. More than what your mind can grasp is your intuitive senses that can be opened to see beyond all your restrictions. You have always had an opening to see beyond what you have known, and this has been purposely kept from you, and this is where you have heard rumors and stories about your nightly dreams. Your so-called dreams is your opening to your intuitive senses that will allow you, the personal you, to excel beyond what you have previously known. Everyone has intuitive senses, and very few people take advantage of what is possible by recognizing something more than their mind can understand. Creation has its place for all of us, and then there is all life, which is far more than anything than what can become with creation. Everything we experience is necessary for us to survive with whatever we choose and decide our life to be. New Kevin Smith is the great witness to something more than what can be taught and learned in any school. It can be so that when anyone first listens to Kevin's intuitive side experiences, also known as real side experiences, from what their personal mind has known, Kevin's manner of expression will at first be rather different to comprehend. This is where this introduction and reading the new books and Facebook groups will help. Have fun deciding. Dwayne the Great Writer and Seer.
As I've shared on previous real side experiences, very often is an opportunity to rescue others, to extricate them from undesirable situations. It must be reiterated that creational mechanics is such that each individual, each awareness operating in creation can only experience within the simulators that which they have created for themselves, for each being is the decider. Each individual is responsible for uploading ideas to the consciousness, a little like the installation of data to our computers by the computer operator, and then that which is installed becomes visible on the computer screens. In the same way, that which we consciousness install, the ideas, becomes effected as the corresponding simulation that we then experience. As the consciousness also affects body vehicles with the mechanism to convert the ideas into a simulation. As an analogy, we rather program a virtual reality headset with the data. The headset has the ability to convert the data into a simulation, and as we operate through the technology, placing on our heads the virtual reality apparatus, so we experience however we have constructed the game that the headset contains. And so begs the question as to why individuals seem to find themselves in simulated situations they rather would not be experiencing. The reality is that although we are in a conscious state of creating ideas, generating thoughts, desires, and intents, which will be consciousness installed and affect their nature at some point, due to the undisciplined nature of most, so will thoughts and emotions of endless variety be constantly created additionally. And as is the mechanics of creation, these effects will be experienced also. As an example, an individual who tends to indulge ideas of a more pessimistic nature, these will then feature as experience in some shape or form that reflects this, depressing, self-destructive thoughts will affect circumstances that mirror such, and the individual may be bewildered as to how they then find themselves in unenviable situations. But not only do we generate our own ideas via the multi-dimensional body vehicles, but just as readily can we take on and consciousness incorporate the ideas as created by others. If done consciously, the idea creation of another would naturally then have appeal, but as every idea is created from a consciousness of a particular design, the idea and its creator are indivisible. As we take on the ideas that others create, this comes as a package deal where we also install the ideas that their consciousness comprises of, and all consciousness design will have a certain overall intent inclination. Intent is an idea as any other, that if agreed to and installed into the consciousness, so we experience the corresponding effect. If a dark force controller presents something simulated as seemingly beneficial, it will be affected from an idea that was generated by a consciousness that is of a controlling inclination. We inadvertently have then taken on the idea that the dark force character now will be controlling us, as we have effectively agreed with this shared simulated scenario, and at some stage this we may potentially experience. Additionally, where we place our attention, what claims our focus, are means by which the ideas that these surface simulated attention and focus securers represent can also be installed. And again, ideas as created by a consciousness, and we also agree and incorporate the ideas that such a consciousness comprises of. As is by now rather apparent, the dark force controllers cannot impact anyone's experience in any way unless the individual agrees and takes on that idea. The controllers understand how creational mechanics work, and therefore utilize this knowledge to have others create the simulated circumstances in which the dark forces can dominate and successfully express abrasively in their experience. And much of that which incorporates into the human consciousness will be subliminal, bypassing the senses, and therefore conscious consideration, directly nestling subconsciously, but regardless will still be a programming of the consciousness that will have the corresponding simulation effected and experienced. Everything in creation is like a computer game. Everything is based on files of idea information that is being shifted from one consciousness to another, and then the simulation follows for the individuals whose consciousness it is. And as we go through our lifetimes, even as we assume new body forms, all the previous lifetime experiences that all stemmed from the ideas we agreed with and created still are present and are rather transferred to a backup storage area, the subconscious. And despite these ideas then being beyond our current memory body's reach and access, they still will be generating their nature in addition to whatever ideas we add to the consciousness in the life we now are experiencing. Potentially then, an agreement secured with, say, a controlling, dominating individual, even millions of lifetimes ago, is a contract that allows that they always can express their dominating inclinations over us in our experiences should our paths converge, and so we may walk into experiences where we suffer abuse at the hands of another, all as an agreed scenario, a little like a movie script shared between actors. Although it is always a choice, just because one is in a position where they can dominate and harm another, they don't necessarily have to adhere to the script as it were, but the potentiality will be there. The process of awareness then is a facing of the entirety of the consciousness idea construct, including the vaster bulk of it, the subconscious, and the idea contracts that we have forged with all those we have encountered since we first entered this simulator. And as we face the consciousness, we also have the option to release the agreement with it, every idea it comprises of, a process which takes the time it will, as certain emotional attachments with ideas will render them as more difficult for the personal self to release. Nevertheless, as the ideas are disassociated from, present they may be, as the consciousness design is maintained, but no longer are we resigned to the effects of it. Consequently, we will progressively be able to operate in creation, physical level and real side, in an untouchable, indomitable state. For absent of the ideas, there cannot be the simulation that follows. If I lack agreement that another can harm, dominate, control, or destroy me, this cannot be experience then shared with this other individual, and although they may attempt to bestow harm upon me, if this is their intent, inclination, and drive, they will be unable. A little like in a computer game, where a monster is programmed to wipe out a village, but there are certain vendors or quest givers who are untouched, despite them seeming being just as vulnerable, simply that the programming, the data isn't there that affects a simulation where the untouched characters can be killed. This process of agreement facing and releasing will take the moments it will, as I said, and oftentimes to discourage those stepping up and taking on such a process, the dark forces will be swift to take advantage of any agreements still unreleased in their consciousnesses, where they can intimidate, harm, or even eliminate the individuals, as the controllers desire all to remain as agreeable slaves, that an overall simulator, according to their controlling wants and design, is perpetuated. And so the targeted individual may have assigned, granted, agreed to a role of abuser, kidnapper, or killer in their experience. As the deciders, they set the stage and provide the roles others can assume. The dark force is eager to step into these roles, but additionally can the target provide the roles of rescuer. For each individual designs their experiential film set like a simulation, including all the roles available that others can assume, either consciously or inadvertently through subliminal subconscious idea implantation, or the taking on of ideas unrealized via the marketed surface fronts. And so, as we feature in the experiences of others, we can only do so within the parameters they set. And as individuals do step up and become more aware, as the dark forces take advantage of agreements still held to, where they can adversely impact them, we also can step in where the role is afforded and assist the individual in these unsavory situations they really had created for themselves. This real side experience would be then a rescue of an individual who, as impressions revealed, was setting his intent to recognize the years, but had fallen foul to agreements, as yet unreleased, that the dark forces were swift to take advantage of. The scene would visually appear as being the interior of a medieval castle, as though a courtroom of a kind. The individual who was embarking on his awareness process was secured to a wooden post, and standing before him was a very menacing character brandishing a curved blade. The room also contained various individuals wearing medieval attire also, as though a jury, for it was rather apparent the aware individual was to be executed. Overseeing this situation was an individual that impressions revealed was a dark force controller of some standing, and here he would be dressed as a king, so all rather theatrical, but the essence of it somewhat serious, effectively the elimination of a human at the hands of the dark forces, due to his intent of stepping up and choosing to become more aware. I would be inserted into this simulated experience, but my actions would be more subtle, as opposed to, say, battling with these dark force characters, for I would in fact be operating as an infiltrator, posing as one of the dark force characters who should have been present but was absent, assuming his appearance and attire that of the chief adviser to the king, the dark force being who was in charge and orchestrating proceedings. For just as the executioner was to deliver a decapitating strike with his blade, I would step swiftly forward and block this action, much to the surprise of the watching jury and indeed the king. The king would demand an explanation as to my interference, and I would explain that although the idea was to slay the bound man, the weapon used was unsuitable. Its design was such that it would require many thrusts to sever the head, and this would be rather unnecessarily brutish and unsettling for the jury. The king deliberated and conceded, and instead, so the executioner would produce another sword, this one, however, somewhat out of place in contrast to the overall medieval setting, as it looked very futuristic, a little like a lightsaber from the Star Wars movies. Before the executioner proceeded with this new weapon, I rather would deliver a very flamboyant speech, honouring the king, speaking of the glorious endeavours of the dark forces, and so forth, which rather claimed the rapt attention of all in the room, all eyes diverted from the man that was to be executed. It was a classic ruse of misdirection, for as I seized the focus and attention of all in the room, so two individuals that my impressions revealed were real guides would release the bound man. However, one of these guides would assume the appearance of him and rather take his place, as the other guide swiftly faded from the scene with the liberated individual. With this achieved, so I ceased my speech and suggested that the execution proceed, and indeed the executioner would decapitate the head from the shoulders of what was in reality now a real guide in the form of the would-be victim. The king was pleased, but his delight would be short-lived, as on release of the bound headless body, so it would as though be animated, stumble around the room as though blind, retrieve its head and place it back on its shoulders. The overall restored and mimicked body form then returned back to that which it had been, that being the body form of the real guide. It was as though the guides were making light of the situation, despite the king and the executioner failing to appreciate the humour of it. For the other guide, who had rescued the man who was to be executed, both were suddenly revealed as having been hiding under a nearby table all along, and rather ran around the room in circles, with the executioner pursuing them with his lightsaber-like sword, a little like a scene from Benny Hill, before both the guides, the man to be executed, and myself faded from the scene, leaving the king and the executioner with their rage at having been denied, and the jury audience looking somewhat confused. As I said, overall the rescue of a man who was stepping up, and as is a constant, protection and assistance is in equal measure to the extent by which we become more aware, as we release agreements which present as unsavoury situations, or in the very least we are open and agreeable to assistance and rescue efforts that other aware beings, new friends, and the real guides can provide. In a scene that followed, one that was unconnected, it would involve again the dark forces. What with the dark forces, in all their expressions and forms, stepping up and becoming more aware like never before, so we must be cautious we don't assume anything when it comes to our dealings with them. We always must endeavour to lean to the real awareness impressions, that we can ascertain the intent of all we encounter on the real side, for what is behind the surface simulated fronts, the exterior friendly countenances, can be an altogether different intent inclination, and as we engage openly with those we think are sincere, so we venture into agreement with them, which can lead to all manner of simulated situations with them, although all experiences, regardless of their nature, are just as references to recognize the years by, comparing what is simulated and created to that which is real, the true reality, and so really it matters not as to if we are deceived, who are the impostors, and so forth, if we regard it all as just ideas and treat them with the objective indifference they deserve. And even if we do find ourselves in untoward circumstances through inadvertent agreements, by being perhaps fooled through the surface simulation, if we fail to pay attention to the real awareness impressions, with every agreement we take on that affects its simulation, we can as readily release once we recognize its nature, and absent of the idea agreement the simulation cannot follow. It simply dissolves away, and we afford ourselves extraction from such scenarios. This scene would be along these lines, that I and a group had seemingly been hoodwinked by certain dark force characters, those presenting as though stepping up, but in reality were maintaining their intent to be destructive and controlling of others. For my group and I would be in a vast building, a little like a hotel, where the supposedly stepping up dark forces had accommodated us, as we engaged in various negotiations, planned assignments, and beneficial projects with them. Interestingly, one of the dark force characters with the most authority had the appearance of the sinister cigarette-smoking man from the X-Files, who in that series would play the role of one of the most highly placed human controllers who oversaw the continued dominance of humanity. As the moments passed, as we continued our engagings with them, we began to become suspicious of their motives and intent, as though the real awareness impressions were seeping in, impressions that had been somewhat blocked by our personal self-created assumptions as to the dark forces' life-beneficial intentions. And indeed, at one point, 2 of the members of my group would mysteriously go missing, the building serving as provided accommodation, as I said, but on questioning the dark force characters and the cigarette-smoking man, they would feign ignorance as to the group members' whereabouts. Impressions would reveal they had been in some way eliminated, and that overall we had been deceived, and so we prepared to evacuate the hotel. Interestingly, my own outer body form was that of Captain Kirk from the Star Trek series, and those that remained of my group were in the forms of the various other Star Trek crew, Spock, the Doctor, Bones, and so forth. On the verge of our departure, we happened to glance out the window and would be dismayed to see a group of bald-headed beings converging on the hotel, for we knew these were assassins dispatched to eradicate the group and myself. They were as though a combination of human and grey alien, tall and spindly, with the large eyes, the bald heads, but with white human skin coloration. We managed to evade them, and on exiting the hotel, we retreated across the grounds surrounding it. Curiously, scattered across the grounds were various stone monuments in various states of decay. The alien-human hybrid assassins were nowhere to be seen. Instead, a group of huge black wolves were in pursuit of us. Though these were not simply animal forms prior to the secondary self being established, these were dark force minions with secondary personal selves and consciousness designs of a destructive overall inclination and intent. They just happened to be in these forms, perhaps as a reflection of their consciousnesses. Bestial consciousness design can have the individual whose consciousness it is, often presented in equally as animalistic a form. The wolves would catch the group and myself, and although killing us was their intention, it was as though they chose to perform a curious magical ritual prior to doing so. The idea was that not only would they destroy our simulated body forms, but our awareness then be positioned in a kind of hellish realm, very likely somewhere lower astral based, imprisoned there through the application of this black magic ritual prior to our demise. We would, however, escape again, disrupting the ceremony, and the wolves once again giving chase. We stumbled into one of the dilapidated stone monuments, and waiting for us there was an individual, a man that impressions revealed was a real guide. He would inform us that through our agreements we had forged with our dealings and engagings with the deceptive dark forces, so we rather were resigned to the effect fallout, the experience we now were going through. That we could, yes, release the agreement, and the experience would cease, or we could play with the ideas that the experience comprised of, which would allow our extrication. Simply ideas that had been created and decided, that had these monuments containing certain geometrical patterns that would afford us protection, as anything's possible in creation. It's just a case of deciding it. It becomes a consciousness installed and effects its simulated nature. And so it was, that within the various monuments were geometry configurations that could be used as a means of denying the wolves their ability of eliminating us and displacing our awarenesses into hellish areas of containment. We elected this option and asked of the guide where the key specific geometric pattern we required could be found. He would smile and incline his head downward, as it was there on the very floor where we stood. The group and I would know what to do, as the real awareness has the overview of everything creational and can provide the personal self with every ability and piece of information required to deal with every situation and eventuality. And so it was that we simply stood within the geometric design as the wolves descended on the monument that we were in and that contained it. The wolves were at first oblivious of the geometry we stood within the confines of, but soon realized its protective qualities, as they were unable to execute the ritual that would have our awarenesses banished to the hell realm. They then abandoned the ritual and attempted to simply slay us, but the geometry also afforded as though a protective barrier the wolves could not penetrate, as they gnashed and snapped their jaws at us in frustration and rage. The wolves were beginning to fade, as though this experience, this assimilation, as effected from the choices made and agreement ideas embraced, was nearing its conclusion. The outcome not preferable for the dark forces and the wolf minions, for their deceptive ruse and attempted elimination and displacing of us had failed. Before the wolves faded, however, I would address the one who presented as their leader. I would ask him as to why he would seek to destroy those becoming more aware, as such individuals have a great impact on creation multi-dimensionally, benefiting all in the simulator they operate within, including the dark forces, and to destroy them is not only destruction wrought on the aware beings, but self-destructive also, as our every action and deed will reflect back at us, as we always must face what we have created. As we destroy others and operate abrasively, so we walk into simulation, creational positioning, and occupy body forms which dismally reflect such choices. My final statement to the wolf was curious, in that I added how the human race was dying out, dwindling in numbers, and it was imperative the dark forces ideally assist and not interfere and disrupt our operations and assignments that are for humanity's benefit. So possibly this was even a future view overall humanity potentiality, where for whatever reasons the human race had been drastically population reduced, but our efforts were ongoing to assist those that remained. But regardless, the wolves would fade from the scene. If they choose to operate differently or continue their destructive drives, would be their decision to make. But for myself, in my Captain Kirk form, and my group as the other Star Trek characters, we also would fade from the scene and the experience end there.